All right, hello everybody. We've got both an in-person audience here and a Zoom audience, and then we've got panelists from very close to our heart, but at some geographic distance. So we'll be introducing everybody. I'm Stuart Harris. I'll be moderating this. We're going to go through and introduce each of ourselves a little bit into this. But the name of this is Temperature is a Vital Sign, but it's going to be a broad-based discussion that I would like you to contribute to as far as climate and health and why the Arctic is something you should pay attention to, even if you're in Boston or especially if you're in Florida. So the place we are talking about is in part Manilik Health Center in Kotzebue, Alaska. But much more importantly, what we are addressing is the people who live there and have lived there for 6,000 to 8,000 years quite successfully, which is not something anybody can say around here, at least maybe not in this audience. And so looking at the impact of how climate is affecting the lived experience right now and the health of this population is something that, again, has absolute relevance to us in the MGHED, to you as citizens around the country and the world. Why so? So the Arctic is warming about 3 to 4 times faster than anywhere else on the planet, and that has a lot to teach the rest of the world about how to be resilient and respond to those changes. Uniquely, the Arctic is underlain in many places by permafrost. And so you've got a couple of interesting facets of that, one in the immediate term as far as infrastructure stability, and the other side of that is the huge impact of carbon that's not built into many of the climate change models. And it's a fantastic amount of carbon, roughly 2x what is extant in the atmosphere right now. So a very, very large number. And so this is really ground zero for climate change. I'm not going to read through this fairly long slide, but the ways in which Arctic populations are going to be impacted even more in the future and are currently being impacted by climate change is vast. Again, from the very short term now phase of melting permafrost, if you've got structures that were built at a time and with the mindset that permafrost is permanent. It's like concrete. It's a great underlayment for whether it's runways or hospitals. And as that now becomes liquid, it's like you've built something to sit on land that suddenly is out on the ocean. It's a whole different engineering problem. The impact on communities that are especially subsistence-based has vast range of impacts from being able to eat to impacts on the community. As permafrost melts, this is, at least 40,000 years of biologic activity that's been locked away and is now being opened up. And we've already had human anthrax cases passed from animals melting out of the permafrost. And if you think about, the influenza pandemic, we've had a nice little pandemic the last few years. But if you want to get really scary, look back to the influenza epidemic of 1918 and others. As you have novel viruses being released, it's something that should definitely get your attention. And then the last but absolutely critical bit is as far as if you have a culture that is that extraordinarily attuned to a landscape, and that landscape is rapidly changing, the ways that that can impact the local communities and individuals in that community is something we definitely need to be aware of. Why do we care here? If you don't ever want to go to the Arctic and you've got a kind of a cold heart, it's purely self-serving. So what's happening in the Arctic is a preview in many ways of what's going to be happening in the rest of the world. So to pay attention there, to learn and to have some empathy is something that is in the American and world citizens' interest. So we're going to very quickly run through introductions of each of the panelists, and then we're going to open things up to your questions. So my 3 minutes, I'm Stuart Harris. I'm an emergency physician at Mass General. I started and run the Wilderness Medicine Division, and now it's the SPEAR Division. which builds in, we have a space fellowship, our ecological work, our austere and Arctic work, and our resource limited work. We do a fair bit of policy. I'm adjunct faculty here in the Arctic Initiative at the Belfer Center. I am lucky enough to have a multi-year association with a lot of the people up on the screen there, Karina and Lucas, much more recently, Paul, through the Manilik Association. I've done a fair bit of work in northern climes from Siberia to Denali with the Park Service and other places, and a lot of work over the years with the Woodwell Climate Research Center, who is intimately involved with the activities of the Arctic Initiative and looking at permafrost change. So I'm a physician, but I started off as a writer, and not a very good one, but I'm still working to get back there. And every year, and as I become a parent and as I become an older physician, the sense that the data, we like to think of ourselves as a data-driven species. We're a narrative-driven species. We tell each other stories. We do what we do because of the stories we've been told. You didn't marry your spouse or become whatever because the data recommended it. You don't have kids because of the data. You do it because of the stories you tell. And I think that's where we are sadly lacking in our response to the threat of climate change and the reality of climate change, is we need to be telling better, more human, more inclusive stories. And as far as the smartest people I've met on the planet are pretty much up there. And the vast majority of my writers, so Jim McPherson at Iowa, Marilyn Robinson, Helen Vendler, who recently moved from this community west, Gary Snyder, Warren Zapal is the one scientist on there, but a brilliant man, John Holdren down at the tent side. And then the fellows over the years, my fellows have been an amazing source of education for me. And the way I approach this is, if you're any good at all in your job as a physician, you take discrete scientific data and you render it into an actionable human narrative. So Ms. Smith doesn't give a poop about her A1C when she has diabetes. It's like, what does that mean? But if you tell her, Ms. Smith, if you want to make your child's graduation, your son's wedding, this is why this number matters. And I think that's something medicine, we don't begin to give ourselves credit for taking that, having that narrative capacity and putting, if the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere are 414 or 420, why does this matter? This is just a number until it's made into a story. And ultimately, it comes down to our work in policy and climate, both locally and globally, it's the ecology stupid. We need to recognize that human health and human wealth are ecological phenomena. Without a functioning biosphere, if you look at the GDP of the entire universe versus the Earth, one is zero and one was about $100 trillion last year. So this crazy ass idea of, well, we're going to figure out what the biological, contribution to the GDP is. It's like, it's 100%. It is the totality of the reason that we have economies. So with all due respect to prior advisors to President Clinton, it's not the economy stupid, it's the ecology stupid. And to recognize that climate change is a healthcare emergency, and that as such, it is entirely healthcare policy. And I think that's the role of the last 20 years. I've been working to get physicians more involved in this discussion. And with that, I will hand things off to Dr. Ford.
Good morning. My name is Paul Ford. I'm a family medicine physician located in Kotzebue, Alaska. In this slide, in the upper left-hand corner, that the hub that's there is our region there in Kotzebue. And you can see we're up in the northwest corner of Alaska, not quite at the very top of the state, but we serve a very large area. Moving on to the next slide. So we serve a geographically very large area, 39,000 square miles. And as part of the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, we're a hub community and a hub hospital that serves 12 communities in total. you can kind of see the map of Alaska in the background, and then our service area in yellow there. Two major river drainages, the Noatak and the Kobuk River, make up our area. And we here in Kotzebue have a, so moving on to the next slide, have basically a 15-bed critical access hospital with a 5-bed ER. And then we rotate about 5 providers per day through our outpatient department. In addition, we provide full dental services, behavioral health services, social med and psychiatric services, and a full cadre of other services that I don't have time to discuss now, but are not typically associated with a healthcare facility, I would say. So that's our main center, but the real kind of heart and soul of our healthcare system here is the village clinics. So each of the 11 outlying villages that we serve that are accessible only by air in the summer, sometimes by water, by boat, and then sometimes by over land by snow machine in the winter, but our no road system in the traditional sense are the village clinics, which are staffed by community health aides who are typically have a high school education with some built upon training on that, and serve as our first contact, eyes, hands, and ears in the communities, and then send patients into our main medical center, which is a picture of down in the left-hand corner. And then our referral center is the Alaska Native Medical Center in Anchorage, which is the primary referral center for the whole state for tribal healthcare. So that's a very brief overview of kind of how we administer healthcare here in our region of the Northwest Arctic. And then I just wanted to touch on the climate impacts as Stuart highlighted, going on to the next slide. There are many, many impacts in our region that we're already experiencing from climate change. One that you'll hear, and I think Corinne's going to talk about this as well a lot locally, is people's concern about their food security. And I found this slide in some presentations we gave recently that I think really illuminates that fact. In our region, the average person here eats over 400 pounds of wild food. And this is also in a place where a dozen eggs cost $8 to $10 at the grocery store. So this is the food security component really strikes me as a really important one to keep in mind, especially as we're seeing dramatic impacts on the food sources here from as a direct impact from climate change. And so with that, I'll move on to the next speaker.
Lucas.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. My name is Lucas Trout. I'm a lecturer on global health and social medicine at HMS and the Ecological project director at Manila. And so I've worked with folks both on the Alaska side and at the Harvard side for the last 10 or 12 years on some of these issues. So I think Stuart and Paul really hit the high points super well, that in Alaska and across the Arctic, the climate is changing faster. People's relationship to their environment is way, way closer. And the health impacts of climate change are, of course, a lot greater due to that interrelationship. I think the point I'd like to add is really that the responsibility to do something about it is also a lot greater in this context. Even through just the very narrow lens of human health, the basis for the whole American enterprise is a series of treaties between indigenous people and their colonists that cede land in exchange for things like all proper care and protection to ensure the highest possible standard of health. And so my view is that the only way to honor those treaties and the trust relationship between Native tribes and the federal government is to consider climate and health together, to make sure that for every $1 billion invested in high-level research and academic activities and all that, there's another 10 or 100 billion that's going directly into adaptation and mitigation and resilience and healthcare projects on the community level that'll give people in their land a shot at surviving intact as a unit through this whole mess. So the model that some of us have been experimenting with at SAMIT over the last decade or so is basically trying to bring the academic medicine mission of teaching, research, care, and service under direct tribal governance in a community context. And so the goal is really to build an ecosystem of researchers and healthcare providers and community faculty and leaders together to set an agenda, to raise money, to implement projects that are grounded in research and in many cases are linked to research funding, but ultimately are geared towards direct community benefit, both in healthcare and things closely related like climate. I think I'm going to hand over to Karina to take it from there.
Uvlalutak, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm Karina Kramer, Uvungakagrak. My Inupiaq name is I'm named after my tata from Norbik, Alaska. And I worked with Lucas for, gosh, I don't even know, 10, 12 years. I don't even know at this point, but we worked on putting together social medicine for Maniluk, and I also have currently working at Ecological Trust, Director of Operations, and I do a lot of community partnerships with universities doing various research. My contribution, I think, today is mostly thinking about the community angle of climate change and health. And some of the things, like my family is very much into subsistence year-round. We consume a lot of our food from our land and sea. And we also give a lot of food away to our communities and teach our youth how to take care of food, make sure that they're doing it right. So food security is really important. Also food safety. In fact, Ecological Trust is just starting a research and planning project with UAF, Dr. Henry Huntington, and the native village of Kotzebue to see if there would be a worthy project of food safety and how foods are put together historically, how they were prepared, and then how we do it currently. And a lot of that has to do, or the effects of climate change and the differences that we see in migration patterns and in snow and ice. For instance, if we don't have snow, the caribou, the ice goes over the tundra so thickly that the caribou can't get the lichen, and the lakes and ponds freeze solidly so that the muskrat aren't able to survive in their environment. All of these different things. We're also noticing changes in the health of our food. For instance, salmon. Years ago, I could put together, I could cut 50 salmon and maybe one might have these pus pockets, and now it's probably 1 in every 5 have these pus pockets. And we're looking into why that is, but I also want to address the mental health of our people and the community, because we put our food together. It's important for us as a community to work together, to share, to be able to. There's Lucas and the team in our living room, and as you see, there's my daughter. We've cut I don't know how many pike, and the food that we eat, as you see here, is very healthy. Has the most nutritious food that you can probably find. So, but the mental health of our people, I remember, I don't know, 8-9 years ago, I was in a reporting meeting with Lisa Wexler, who does suicide prevention in our region. And there's something that really struck me, because they interviewed multiple age groups of people, and the elders said the way to help suicide prevention and the mental health of our youth is to do subsistence, and the youth were saying we just need someone to talk to. Well, there was an elder sitting behind me, and she said, well, that's what we mean, because when we work on our food together, that's the time that you talk, and that's the time that you really help one another with some of the issues that we're going through and encourage each other. That's the time that we do that. And so if we're not doing that, then we don't have that time together, and that's really important. So anyway, I just wanted to thank you for inviting me here, and I'll pass it on to the next person.
Hi, y'all. My name is Rob Inglis. I am a emergency doctor and assistant professor of emergency medicine at the University of Vermont. And I'm so excited to see all of you here, those that made it in person. I just a very brief background, and then I'm going to hand the mic off to the next. I've been interested in climate change and health for a long time. First became interested as a college student. Then my first job out of college was with the USA Antarctic program. Became even more interested then. That was also what sort of led me into medicine. I got to know the station doctor down there, and thought that it just seemed like a really cool set of skills that they had. I took a circuitous path to medicine. I worked as an environmental journalist for High Country News and the New Republic. Also worked on Capitol Hill in DC. And then took a circuitous path through medical training and spent a year with Stuart doing a research fellowship with the Division of Wilderness Medicine here at MGH, working on projects in Nepal, and then also working with Lucas and others in Alaska. I'm currently, as I said, at the University of Vermont. Research interests include the many mechanisms of climate's impact on human health, particularly those around air quality. So I think to the extent that I can contribute to something to this discussion, it'll be not the hyper-local expertise. I'll defer to Karina, Lucas, et cetera, for that, but sort of tying it into the some of the broader trends and climate impacts on human health. And yeah, I'm just excited to see all of you here and look forward to chatting more.
Hi, everyone. My name is Suzanne Leslie. I am the current MGH Wilderness Medicine Fellow, spending my time here at MGH in the Emergency Department and out at Manilic. I've also had the pleasure and privilege of getting to go to at least one of the 11 villages that the Manilic helps field patients from and take care of, and that was Norvik. I'd like to keep my personal introduction short as possible so that you guys can have plenty of time both in person and on Zoom to ask questions of the panel. So happy to open things up from there.
So Liz, we have the capacity to field questions from afar. In the interval, does anybody who's immediately at hand have anything? We can talk as broadly or narrowly as you wish. So there are no bad questions. Yes, ma'am. Me here.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining for the panel today. Excited for the discussion. So actually one thing that I discussed in one of my courses today was we read this op-ed regarding this idea of managed retreat with areas that are generally, I think this comes up with fires or flooding and like moving populations out of those areas because it's too hard to keep like fixing things after natural disasters. So as you think about the Arctic, obviously we should be trying to limit humanity's impact on the climate there and supporting the populations that live there. But is there a line in people's heads right now that's like, at some point we need to move communities? Is that like a conversation that's being had in the Arctic region?
Karina, would you like to, I think you're epically well placed, unfortunately.
Yes, the answer is yes. We we do have some really frontline communities that are seeing more and more of their coastlines being just destructed at this point. The fall seasons of storms are really hard on these frontline communities, and Kivalina in particular, because if you look on a map, Kivalina is just a strip of land, a small strip of land between the ocean. So they're looking at relocating a few of our villages in the region.
And any other panelist at any point, leap in and feel free to.
Hi, I have a follow-up question to that one, and I'm wondering, I recently heard a series of presentations on villages that were experiencing these climate changes, erosion and flooding, and during the storm, there was a massive storm last fall that just pummeled Nome, and it's absolutely, completely, it's devastating when you see community after community just experiencing these tremendous impacts on their food systems, on their traditional livelihoods, et cetera. And the cost of moving such villages is so high. And now it's unfortunately not only Alaska, but places like Vermont. This July, the capital of Vermont was flooded, and over, communities are experiencing very expensive costs. And I'm just wondering, is there a discussion in Alaska that you've heard, Karina, about communities combining efforts? Not that it would be desirable, it wouldn't be a first choice, but hey, could we move our communities together? Or could we, or is anyone thinking about moving to a hub town like Kotzebue and then rebuilding a smaller town to preserve fish camps or something like that? I'm just wondering, because the cost is going to be so tremendous and it doesn't seem feasible to help every single village. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that, I have not heard of any talks like that. We have sub-region connected villages. For instance, Ambler, Shugnak, and Kobuk are very close together. But they're way inland. So I have not heard them doing that. But I think on the community and social scale, historically, our communities did that when there was a need for, like my original family is from Deering, and they migrated over to Norvik and basically made Norvik. And so, but I think the thing is, though, is that every community socially has their we're our own culture in our own community, and it's everything that we do is reliant on the subsistence and what we're catching, and at what times, and all of that. So I can't really imagine communities basically merging, and because they're located there for a reason. Kivalina, for instance, they have the best trout in the world, the biggest and best trout in the world. Look it up. But yeah, so and they're on a caribou migration pattern, and they get a lot of beluga, and whereas Upper Kobuk, they have different types of fish that we don't get, or things like that. So I think socially it would be a little more difficult, but yeah, I haven't heard of any. No.
I just have one thought about that. It's not related to Kivalina, but rather to Vermont, which you just mentioned, where I live, which is that it seems like we're creating a bit of a binary between like inhabited by human beings and just sort of left in a retreat. And it seems like there's actually a middle ground of, there were a number of towns and river valleys in Vermont that have farms or playing fields that have been built, they've zoned them well so that there's no structures that would be damaged by flooding that are in the floodplains. And so just thinking about ways to, Kivalina is a different case because it's fully eroding, in my understanding, and it's not as if it's a temporary flood, but I think in a lot of places there's possibilities to not, to do some middle ground between a full managed retreat and we're just digging in, we're building bigger dams, bigger levees.
Yeah, and I think, Margaret, your question is exactly spot on in that the idea of the Arctic, again, being a canary in the coal mine, that this is something, 5 years ago even, this conversation would have been very different than it would be in the last 18 months with major insurance pulling out of huge markets, whether in California or Florida. You've got, the boreal wildfires that are having broad impact. So just how these changes are becoming manifest, we were seeing the signal and it was very clear that it was going to happen. But now we're seeing it happening here. We're seeing it happening now, and that idea of, when you get to a tipping point. So if you're on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, at what point, or on, very coastal Florida, where you don't have the topographic relief to retreat effectively as seas rise. These are huge problems that are going to be politically, we need to be extraordinarily thoughtful about how we address them, because communities are at risk. And again, this isn't like, well, one day this will be a problem. This is already happening now and in the lower 48. So yes.
Moving away from the infrastructure and food scarcity topics we've been talking about, what population health challenges or health outcomes have been exacerbated by climate change in the Arctic?
I can try to field that a little bit. The short answer is we don't know. We are talking actively right now about how to study these things, because it's obviously hard. There's everything's so multifactorial. But I could speculate, but I don't think there's a good answer right now. And I think that's part of the reason why we're all together, is to start to talk about how we can, more clearly elucidate those things.
So one of the projects that I'll be working on in my time up in Alaska is just how to measure that, and looking at the emergency visits both to the hospital in Kotzebue and also to the clinics, looking for combinations in terms of respiratory conditions, as you're talking about with air quality, looking at correlations between the temperature on any given day or season and increases in cardiovascular incidence, looking at how changes in traditional food consumption is affecting things like diabetes, as we saw the very healthy food that Karina was able to show from a subsistence lifestyle. As those food sources are not available, then people are relying on other food that is able to be purchased. And these are people that have really sort of evolved to exist on the given lifestyle and those food sources. And I think that as you're seeing a shift away from those traditional diets, you're also seeing shifts in different types of health issues. So a current project that we're working on is taking all of those visits to the clinics and to the emergency departments and tabulating them so that we can make correlations with seasonal patterns and migration patterns and food that is able to be caught, whether it's beluga or fish or berry picking and those sorts of things. It's very much something that we're trying to study and correlate so that we can come back and tell people just how it's being affected.
And again, this is something that has huge relevance to the rest of the developed world and in the developing world, but just that sense of, we make a massive investment in emergency care, and the canary in the coal mine, that sensing mechanism of emergency medicine to both qualify and quantify how climate impact is hurting people right now. And so there have already been published studies looking at, fine particulate matter from forest fires in the Arctic and on the West Coast having impact in emergency department visits on the East Coast. Clearly, temperature and heat are already having marked impact. And these are things that it's just going to become more and more clear the further we go along, but using that mechanism of just with emergency medicine acting oftentimes as the front door between the rest of the world and medicine, to look at who's coming into emergency departments, just as we did. A great model for this is COVID. When COVID first, was on the scene, it's like, how do we know who has it and how do we quantify it? And so that ability of emergency medicine and people's visits to emergency departments as a means of, again, quantifying and qualifying how this is being impacted is an area that we've got one grant off. We're going to get another one off shortly.
All right, we have a ton of great questions on Zoom. So we're going to take one from Brittany Janice, who asks, Karina talked a bit about the importance of preparing food together as one way to address the mental health crisis facing communities in Alaska. Are there other examples of ways traditional knowledge can help build resilience in communities? And are there ways for policy to help incentivize those kinds of solutions? So I don't know who wants to take that.
Karina, you want to start off, and I'll gladly follow up with a personal anecdote.
Well, there's been so many changes. We had our first Nalawami visitors coming up in the late 1900s or 1800s, and so the quickness of colonization has happened, and there has been different types of things that have affected our connection to who we are and the health of that. So, for instance, there were 2 generations sent out to boarding school. And that is where we have an oral history. So our oral history is not written down. It was, thankfully recorded by the wisdom of our elders back in the 70s and 80s. And that's what the trust is working on, is trying to get that information out. But there was a disruption in learning about who we are, in eating, learning how to prepare our foods, learning how to appreciate, having an identity as an Inuit for the younger generations. And so getting traditional knowledge out to them, and let me just add this, there's also a resurgence of young people wanting to know who they are. They're identifying more and are excited about learning who they are. And so putting those 2 things together, we were able to get traditional knowledge out there to help connect people back to wanting to be Inupiaq and living our lifestyle, and even eating our foods. One of the panelists mentioned Norvik, where my family is from. My sister went to go visit, and she noticed that the teenagers didn't want to eat our traditional food. The young kids were all around the table, and they're so cute because they're like little birdies, and they just come and get more food, and you just put it in their mouth. But the teenagers want chicken nuggets, processed foods, chips, pop, all these things. And it's like a weird area of shame, I guess, or peer, projected peer something where they just don't want to eat it. And that is really affecting not only the physical health of those generations, but also the mental health, because of the things that I mentioned before. I hope I answered.
And Karina, just to speak more broadly, again, this is, I think, universal in its impact, and the data behind, what kids eat in the rest of the developed world. Do they spend family time together? That's impact on, morbid obesity, kind of dangerous obesity, on mental health problems. These are things that they're very true in the Arctic, and they're equally true in the developed world. We're all kind of busy people, but one thing that, if it's at all possible, we sit down as a family and we eat together. And remembering my parents, this sense of groundedness that I carry through the world. It started at the dinner table. They're both physicians and very busy, but mom in particular, it's like we sit down to dinner, and that's in our house. If there's any way possible, we sit down to dinner, and I think that sense is it has huge impact in Boston and the ability of whatever your chosen family is. That you have that sense of grounding, and the breaking of bread is a powerful metaphor that has durable impact. So good luck, Karina.
We do another one from Zoom. We've got a couple people in the Zoom Q&A asking generally about the impact of climate change on sanitation in Alaska and what you may or may not be seeing on the ground as a result of those impacts.
Lucas, you want to give that a swing, or Paul? And I'm sorry, Paul, I cannot see you, but so if you're expressing interest, you need to do so verbally.
Yeah, I'm here, Stuart. Certainly not an expert on that topic, but the big picture is that throughout our region, we are seeing infrastructure threat from climate change. That's throughout the Arctic in general, and especially in our Northwest Arctic region. This is a little bit of a tangent from the question, but one of the major changes that's been appreciated in recent years is streams that have traditionally run clear for known history are running orange. There's a group from the University of Alaska Fairbanks that was investigating that this summer, kind of an on-the-ground research project. Their results haven't been released yet, but they're trying to figure out if this is a mineral issue or if this is an algal issue or bacterial even. And so there are significant threats to infrastructure and significant changes on the land itself that have the potential to dramatically affect human health in our region.
I would add one thing on top of that as well, is that I think we've started to see the prospect of climate change causing villages to need to relocate as an excuse for disinvestment in local infrastructure. We've heard people saying like, well, if you're going to have to move anyways, then why would you go to the effort of getting off the honey bucket system and having like a real sanitation infrastructure in the village, which is frustrating if there is also no money or support for that village moving, if that's going to be what happens. So I suspect that could become a larger issue as climate change gets worse, that more and more it'll come up that if folks are going to have to move anyways, then why would you invest in the infrastructure needed to raise quality of life or sustain quality of life now?
I just want to say, I think that's such an interesting question. The question of how climate change is impacting water and sanitation infrastructure, and just to put it in a bit of a global context, there's several buckets of really big health impacts on climate change that we're seeing. The one that's most tractable to research is probably the impacts of air pollution on health. And so we have pretty good evidence that the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which does the annual Global Burden of Disease study, thinks that it's about 3,000 disability adjusted life years lost per 100,000 people per year due to PM 2.5 air pollution. And that's a reasonably good set of error bars around that. That puts it as a really big source of disability and death in the world. It's about the same as tobacco smoking and a little more, according to their estimates, than the sort of westernized diet that we all know and love and is killing us. But I would say that water, sanitation, and food access are kind of the dark matter of climate impacts on health. They're really big, and we don't have as good a way of studying them. And so it's really interesting to hear people like Karina and Lucas who have this on the ground, sort of embodied knowledge of this stuff, because we know it's really big. We don't have really good ways of putting a global number on how much damage it's going to do, but it's clearly doing a lot of damage.
And just one more to throw out. There's a great book by, I think, Scott Reynolds called Oceans of Grain. I'd recommend highly. It's just a great look at and he wrote it before the Russian invasion, at the extraordinary fecundity of the Ukrainian soil and its impact over the last 2,500 years on the building of empires, and how, again, ultimately economies and empires are based on that produce grain. So it's something that, just because Iowa's been very fecund and Ukraine has been, as climate changes, it basically comes down to that ability to provide caloric value to people, or in the case of the French Revolution, as recently as the Arab Spring, if people get hungry, they get angry really quickly, and civil disruption occurs, which is something everybody in this room cares about a great deal. Is there another?
Yeah, I just wanted to add in to the atmospheric chemistry part. It's on, isn't it? Yeah. That in the past, it was rare that you would get a transpolar transport because of the jet stream. But with global warming, what we see is that the jet stream is changing and shifting south. And with that, you'll get transport across from Russia to the Arctic region. Historically, what you would see is increases once or twice a winter in trace metals and such like that, and it would go sky high, and it changed all the concentrations of oxidants. So as that increases, which is probably happening now, you'll see a lot more of that in the Arctic region as it moves its way south. So y'all are doing exactly the right things.
Hi, my name is Rita Isa. I'm a primary care doctor and a visiting researcher here. And I'm looking at solastalgia, which is a mental health consequence of environmental change, the loss of cherished environments. I'm also really interested in how we mobilize health workers and use what health workers are seeing and witnessing on the ground in terms of driving climate action and decisive climate policy. And it seems to me like there's a bit of a gap, because we all know that we're witnessing and responding to these health impacts, and yet we don't have, for me at least, quite enough systematic ways of driving change at the more upstream level. And I was just wondering if you had any kind of ideas or suggestions around that, how we can mobilize the health worker voice.
I'd be happy to take first swing at that. So Professor Hansen gave his testimony before the US Congress in '87, as I remember, saying, we've got real problems here. Carbon dioxide is something you should be paying attention to. I wrote a very bad first novel, 89 to 91, looking at that, just because it's like you start messing with fundamental systems and bad things happen. And then when I finished my residency in emergency medicine in '03, at that point, I had taught with the National Outdoor Leadership School, and just that experiential education, getting people outside, I think removes, where we are, we can flip on the lights, we can turn on the AC, we can, flush the toilet, turn on the spigot and the water flows. We're very isolated, or insulated rather, from what's going on in the fundamental systems. But so I went to Harvard Medical School to propose a course at that point, essentially on climate change and health. And they said, Dr. Harris, this is great. This is lovely. Rather than going outside, why don't you do it on the quad? And the climate change part of it, we're not even sure that's real. Why don't you, maybe public health, but not even that. And so for the last 19 years, we've been teaching senior medical students, as much as anything, just the language and the vocabulary of how do you look at this? How do you look at health as an ecological phenomenon? So health isn't something that doctors provide or pharmaceuticals provide, or big investments. It's the functioning biosphere that allows all of this. And at the end, we come in and try to help things. And so as much as anything, I think it is that it's the intellectual, ethical jujitsu and in Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold talked about this very clearly in 1948, it's an ethical change of how do you begin to value the living systems upon which our health and wealth depend, and just see them appropriately. So that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but that sense of, I think, of reading, of getting outside, of getting to a groundedness, and willingness to, again, fight this idea that climate change isn't something doctors, stay in your lane. It's just crap, how dare you? No, this is our lane. These are our patients, and this is our planet, and this is real. So. But thank you. Anybody on the world?
I have a question. So Lucas mentioned that sometimes the relocation issue is used as an excuse for disinvestment. I'm curious to know what you all think are the primary areas where investment is most needed to help, combat some of these climate change impacts on health and to support some of the direct care that you guys are providing.
Which one of you on the screen wants to go first?
Well, as Dr. Leslie pointed out earlier, and I talked about earlier, I think, there's a lot of questions that we have. I think we have more questions than answers right now for that, as far as figuring out ways to intervene, ways to adapt, ways to mitigate. From a healthcare perspective, I think that supporting research efforts is the first step right now to being able to identify avenues where we can intervene in the healthcare from the perspective of healthcare. It's an unsatisfying answer. I'd like to say, put your money here and we're going to be able to address these impacts of climate change in our community. But I think defining what they are is probably the next step for us in a lot of ways. I'll let others speak.
Karina, where would you like to see more investment?
That's a loaded question, because I think, this is a larger problem, a very complicated problem, and it ties in with our people. It ties in every way. So my own personal thought and what I'm trying to attempt to do in our area is to really invest in the next young leaders, helping them understand about the science of it. In fact, we have our interns on the call now who are studying these types of things, and then give them critical thinking skills and be able to tell the story. Like I think you said, Stuart, in the beginning, that the storytelling part is really important, and we're natural storytellers. We have an oral history, and that's how we do things. But when there's a disconnect with the younger generations and the lack of leadership, I see on one of the questions that, the high school educated level of people and doing basic levels of care in the villages, I think for me, it's really having people from the areas that we're talking about know how to advocate, know how to bring these stories to reality for people that aren't from our area. And what I'm seeing is that is really starting to affect policy. And that's really the only way to do it. So I'm kind of starting from scratch as far as starting with a new generation of people and really investing in them and helping them to tell the story that we need so that can affect bigger change.
Beautiful, thank you. Does anybody else have a very quick question? We got maybe 1 minute left, and I want to be mindful of everybody's time.
Thank you all so much. This is so important. And I sort of to that question, I'm a theater and performance studies scholar who's interested in climate change in the Canadian Arctic, and I've talked to some arts organizations there. In terms of storytelling, can any of you think of any arts organizations that might be meaningfully connected to like the mental health efforts or helping with the recovery of storytelling in a sort of artistic direction?
I don't know about organizations, but one of the projects that I was just talking to our grant writing intern yesterday is to reinstitute performing arts basically as a connecting that piece. I was just in Nunavut and Pond Inlet, and the young people were doing like a show basically of the history of their people, the meanings, their stories, their songs, their games, all of these things. And it was just so amazing to have them present that. So one idea that we have is at Ecological Trust is creating basically a framework for different villages to tell their story and to be able to have their young people basically perform their story, you know, for each other in a storytelling way. I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Karina. I think with that, we will draw to a close. But again, that just silo mentality of this is arts and sciences, this is storytelling, this is science, this is medicine, is crap. You know, we're all in this together, and we've got one little dot in space that we get to play together on peacefully. And so, you know, the audience and the questions we had here today are just tremendous. So thank you, and thank you. And with that, I'll, Karina, thank you from far away, and Lucas and Paul, and Rob and Suzanne close at hand. So thank you very much. And this is the first of many to come. So thanks.